All right, folks, this is my first attempt at recording a video FacPac. Let's see how this goes. So I'm going to bounce back and forth. This is for the FacPac for lesson IA-14 on country analysis and location strategy using the case study on Intel locating a new assembly and test plant. I'm going to demonstrate, show, and bounce back and forth among the different materials. And hopefully the video will capture everything that is on my screen as well as my voice. So first, this is actually the beginning of the slides that are on the R drive, but also to orient where this case is fitting or this class is fitting among the others. So I have the start off information here, just sort of as I always do, sort of saying where we are in the course. We are, of course, in the conduct portion of the combined business economics and industry analysis sequence. Of course, in the global strategy portion, and in fact, within global strategy, we talk about where global strategy here again is positioned within the conduct portion, right, and how it fits in with what we've done so far in modules 2, 3, and 4, or 2, 3, 4, now 5. And I talk about then the different lessons that are in this module. So far, we will have at this time, this will be Monday, we're teaching this class. We will have covered, of course, the comparative advantage gains in trade. So the basic idea of why nations trade, IA-13 about this idea, what does it mean for international strategy and global strategy on the firm level, will be the lecture in Baruch. And then now we have our first case study of the module where we're looking at, in particular, a sort of a country analysis and location strategy decision. And again, the idea being what we're talking about is a firm deciding where to locate some element of its value chain, some activity, some plant, some facility, some portion of what it does, where we're going to locate that, right? So that's the theme of lesson 14. So, all right, so let me step back then. So that's sort of where it is. Those are the first slides. Let me bounce back actually to first. Let me show you. I'm going to show you materials, all of which are available on the R drives. This is actually, if you look here, this is the what's on the R drive. It's probably too small on your screen to see, but this is what's on the R drive. And so all of what I'm going to show you is available on the R drive. Now, first, what I want to show you is, of course, the lesson syllabus, probably the most important thing to understand overall what's going on here. So this is the lesson syllabus. You should be able to, as I go through this, it's best you either have electronic copies or physical copies of what I'm showing here. But let me, I guess I'll go ahead and make it page width so you can see here. Again, the objective here is to illustrate and experience business decision-making related to global strategy, international expansion, and value chain disintegration, dispersion, and location, right? In particular, we're focusing on the decision about where to locate. That we're trying to, they will have previously had the lecture, which covered a lot about global strategy in general. This is simply about location choice, right? The case study is the Intel strategic decisions in locating a new assembly and test plant case study. We'll talk about that in a second, but I wanted to first talk about the readings so you understand the concepts that this lesson is designed to teach. So they have two essential concept readings. One is actually an abridged version of, it's written by the case author. So it's on point with exactly what the case author is wanting to teach, Juan Alcacer. And it looks something like this. Right, so this is actually, I created an abridgment because the original had references to Intel, so basically had information about the case study. So I needed to take that out, but it basically covers, it's just a short four-page reading that covers basically this framework that he has for location strategies, right? So the idea of looking at location characteristics, government incentives, firm fit, and competitive effect for looking at location strategies, which is to directly facilitate what we're doing in the discussion of the case study. Also, though, the other essential reading is a selection from their text on Grant, their contemporary strategy analysis. You'll notice, by the way, I've now, because you all have copies of the 9th edition of Grant, but they do not all have copies, so I'm just referencing the page numbers, etc., from the 7th edition, which is the one that I have an electronic copy of and which is available for the students on Blackboard. And also you can see what they have by looking on R drive if you want. But this chapter, so again, this is just a selection. It's a total of about 10 or 11 pages on, in particular, location choices, right? Location decision making. And you'll see in the slides, actually, at the start of the class, I have slides that sort of cover the key elements that go into at least the first part of this. The second part of the reading is about entry strategies. like modes of entry. I don't really talk about that. You certainly can if you want. The students are going to read about it, but I don't really talk about modes of entry. I don't think it's as important for our students because they're not going to be making those decisions about how to enter. They're going to be more evaluating, why their firms or their, chose to locate where they choose to locate, not necessarily how they do it. So, so they're welcome to talk about it. They will have read about it. So again, those are the two essential concept readings. The supplemental concept readings, one of them, the first one is actually a reading they had in strategy. So they should still have this. I asked Brian Collins, and they still have this. It's this country analysis framework. So they still have this reading from strategy. And this is the idea about evaluating the natural business environment and that they used in the strategy module, strategy course, I'm sorry. It is different from our lens. They're looking at it from a different perspective than the lens that we're looking at it from a business sort of location decision, right? But I think it's important to show integration across the courses and not suggest that we aren't aware of what they did there. And it certainly is complementary to what we're going to do. So I just sort of have that as one of the supplemental readings because the students already have that. And then the other one is I did post a research article called Factors Affecting Location Decisions in International Operations. It's a Delphi study. It's right, let me show it to you here. And again, this is a research paper. This is a supplemental reading, so they don't have to read this, right? I don't really expect very many, maybe 5% of the students to look at this. I don't know how many would, but it is interesting. It is a Delphi study, so it's basically survey-based of asking, managers and leaders how they chose to make different location decisions. So it's actually self-reported location decision making, which I think is interesting, to look at instead of sort of prescriptive, but more descriptive of how they actually make location decisions. And if you look through that, you'll see there's a description of the approach, the methodology approach, but they actually show for a number of different questions sort of the way that these managers answer their questions how they were making their location decisions, right? And so what was important to them. And so I think it's instructive. For us as faculty members, certainly have access to, but students, if they want to, can look at it. But again, it's a supplemental reading, right? So I don't tend to emphasize supplemental so much. So those are the readings, again, the essential and supplemental concept readings for this lesson. The case study for this lesson is Intel, Strategic Decisions in Locating a New Assembly and Test Plant. So here's the case study, right? Intel Strategic Decisions in Locating a New Assembly and Test Plant. What do you really need to know about this, right? What you need to know about this case study, of course, obviously you know everything about it, but what I would say just now for the FacPac purposes is it basically gives not a lot of background on the semiconductor industry, but the students, remember, have had the Intel case in the fall in business economics. Some of you may not know that because you didn't teach BE, but for Steve Bloor or Scrappy or others who did not teach in the fall in business economics, they did have a lesson on Intel. In fact, I'm happy to, the case study is on the R drive if you want it for the Intel case study. We taught it, did we teach it last year? I can't remember if we taught it last year. No, we didn't teach it last year, last academic year, but it was taught in the fall in business economics. So students have a good understanding of the semiconductor industry, or should, from that experience, right? But this case study doesn't talk too much about it. Talk a little about Intel and about semiconductors, but it is mostly about choosing where to locate their production. And so most of the case study is, after introducing the industry and Intel, talks about how they approach the idea of locating a new plant, right? And then talks about their potential sites, which are China, in particular Dalian, China, and I'll show you where that is in a map in a second. But Dalian, China, Chennai, India, Thailand. In particular, it says Amada Industrial Estate Parks, but it's important to understand it's right outside Bangkok. And finally, Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, in Vietnam, right? And so those are the four choices they're looking at. And so that's what the case study. So the case study is the reading is about 11 pages of reading of text, if you will. And I said about half of that is just about talking about the different locations, the pros and cons of the different locations. Among the exhibits, what you should be aware of, there is this exhibit which has some location information for both Intel's plants as well as their competitors' plants. You'll see I highlight, because I think it's relevant, where Intel's located in Asia, and also where its competitor, or its prime competitor, Micron. I'm sorry, not Micron, AMD. In particular, Micron, I don't highlight that much because Micron doesn't really do logic. Micron does memory, so it's not really. It's a competitor in some sense, certainly a competitor in terms of for engineering talent and things like that, but not a competitor in the product market really as much for Intel, but AMD is. So you'll see in a second I highlight where AMD is located. They certainly have the income statements here, et cetera, but I don't think that's going to be that relevant. What I think might be relevant, this is an exhibit. This is Exhibit 4, which talks about sort of how Intel's criteria, what they care about, in terms of their location characteristics that they care about when they're choosing a new location. But there's also what you should be aware of is are the following two exhibits. Exhibit 5, it's not going to come up in detail, but you should be aware of it. These are key commercial indicators and worldwide development indicators for the 4 countries, for China, India, Thailand, and Vietnam, right? And there is some eye-opening information in there, whether it be in terms of tariff rates or tax rates or level of corruption, these sorts of things. These are ways you can compare at the country level, some data that may not be in the text of the case study. So you should be familiar with that exhibit. And then Exhibit 6. Right, Exhibit 6 is 2 pages long, and it goes through on each of the 4 locations more on, instead of a country level, on a city level or a community level, if you will, sort of more local level. Trade-offs between Dalian, Chennai, Bangkok, and Ho Chi Minh City. And here we have industries present, education and talent, roadways and access, airport, port, power, water sources and reserves, telecommunications, trade policy for foreign investors. I will tell you that when you look at that Exhibit 6, sometimes it's hard to tell, right? They talk about the airports, they describe them. It's hard to tell which one's more advantageous than others. Some things are easy to tell, though. For example, the power, it actually has here. I know you're looking at this vertically, of course, I apologize for that. But you can actually, it actually has, for example, the rate per kilowatt hour for the different locations. And there's a big difference, right? Here we are, 10 cents per kilowatt hour in China, in India, 11 cents per kilowatt hour in Chennai, down to only 6 cents per kilowatt hour for Ho Chi Minh City. Same thing with water. It's actually got data on the actual cost of water. And so my point being, Exhibit 5 and Exhibit 6 are relevant. I would even encourage students to look at them, not suggest there's some great mystery in there, but they are helpful in addition to what's in the text of the case study. All right, so that's sort of the case study. What students are asked to do, right? So here there's 5 discussion questions, right? And they actually correspond to the pre-class survey, which I'll show you in a second. So the discussion questions are simply go through each question for each of the characteristics that is part of the framework that they have in their reading. So remember, going back to this reading here, the dimensions of location strategy, location characteristics, government incentives, firm fit, and competitive effect, right? So they're then asked, okay, in terms of location characteristics, I asked them, for which of Intel's 4 location options is this dimension a particularly significant consideration, right? Either in favor or against that location. So in other words, I'm not saying which one has the best location, but which one, the characteristics, are they significant? And that's important, you'll see, for discussion purposes, because if you want to remember, the whole point of this is not to solve Intel's problem. The point is to give students practice with the framework and the way of thinking. So therefore, these questions will allow you to sort of, if you want to talk about location characteristics, it will identify which countries are most relevant for that. And so then same thing with government incentives, firm fit, competitive effect. And finally, the most important one is, where would you choose? That's the most important question. Let me see, I'm going to see if I actually have it up here. So let me pull up the pre-class survey. So let's see here. So you can see how that translates into questions here. All right. So you'll see, again, question 1. It says, the first dimension of location strategy is location characteristics. For which of Intel's 4 location options are such considerations most relevant or salient to the location decision, right? Weighing either in favor or against that particular location. Let me zoom in a little bit here, but you can certainly see it on your own. But the idea being, so then what's going to happen is you'll have that for each of the 4 characteristics. So what's going to happen is you're going to know going into class, if you download this, and you don't have to have individual student responses. You can if you want, but even if you aggregate, right, you will know, okay, the students thought that Thailand, was what had really some compelling either pro or con when it came to, for example, Thailand should be competitive effect, as you'll sort of see, right? And so you'll know, or in terms of firm fit, right? China is probably the most logical one to go there because they already have 2 locations in China, right? Or they may say, you know, government incentives, right? But the point is that you will, from the first 4 survey questions, you will know sort of which, if you want to talk about one of the dimensions, you'll know where the students think that you have a most interesting case study to talk about. Because some of them, you know, there's not a lot to talk about, you know, say, maybe not a lot to talk about, say, the firm fit in, you know, Vietnam, right? Might not be a lot of discussion on that. But if you want to talk about firm fit, you might want to talk about China, where they already have 2 plants, right? So again, that's the whole motivating thing of these survey questions. You will have identified in the students' minds, you know, and you'll force students to think about each dimension and facilitate that discussion. And of course, the last most important one is, again, where would you choose, right? Of these 4, you force the students to put them in the shoes of Intel. That's this is why this case, any case that forces students to make a decision that managers make, I think is ideal. And this one makes them actually do that, to choose where the location would be. All right. So with that background, then, so what do I do? So understand that. So again, students will have, going back to, let's go back to the syllabus here. Just understand. So students will have, prior to class, they hopefully, you know, will have read the case study. They will have read these concept readings, background. Again, not a lot, 4 pages on here, 8 pages there. Very little reading beforehand in addition to the case study. And they will have been asked 5 questions, 1 for each of the 4 dimensions of location strategy, and 1 overall assessment, right? To think about this idea of, they will have applied in their minds the framework before coming into class to facilitate that discussion in class. Okay, so then once they've done that, right? So let me go back to the slides now. So because then what happens is after we're at this point here, so what I will do is, you'll see I will have motivated this. We already saw these slides, and I say, okay, here we are. You know, we're on lesson 14. This is what it's about. It's about choosing where countries, putting ourselves in the shoes of a firm making a country or location decision, right? And then you'll see that the slides that I posted initially, I actually, during the discussion, right? Let me step back there. Remember, they have had these 2 essential readings. One is from their textbook, from the Contemporary Strategy Analysis textbook, and one is specifically by the author of the case study about this. And during the discussion is designed, the case is designed to facilitate looking at location strategies from the framework that Juan Alcacer likes to use. So therefore, what I wanted to do, though, is I wanted students to be aware of these other perspectives here that's in the reading. And so that's why in the slides, before we get into the case study, up front of the class, I am going to say, okay, what does your reading from Grant say in terms of international location decisions? And I'm not going to read these slides to you, right? But you'll see that these slides basically summarize everything that's in that Grant reading about location strategy. So it talks about, you know, certain determinants about the national resource availability, firm-specific competitive advantages, and, you know, whether they are transferable, tradability of the product. You know, is this something that you can even locate internationally, right? You can look at, on the first dimension, about resources. What about human resources and labor costs? Here's some data updated. They will have had, remember, their Grant reading is actually, it's a 2010 edition of Grant. Therefore, they have this data in their reading, but only up through 2006. This is up through 2012. That's because I got it from the 9th edition now, right? But it shows sort of the hourly labor cost in manufacturing in U.S. dollars, right? And you can sort of see, you know, for example, where the U.S. ranks, right, in terms of labor costs, right? But also where, you know, who's at the low end. But it's also interesting to look at the growth. You look at Korea, you know, going from 32 cents an hour, you know, back in 75 to, you know, 2072 by 2012. So again, you sort of see trends, but also, you see patterns over time, but also patterns across countries in terms of labor costs. So that's the whole, one of the issues that, of course, determines where people locate things. It's important. Now, this may, I probably will have this in this next thing is, I think students should understand, we've talked about the idea of value chain, but depending upon what you've done in your class, the notion of the value chain, it's in their reading, but may not have come up too much. Remember, in particular, when we talked about activities in lesson IA, I want to say 5, right, the Coors case, we talked about activity system maps. We really didn't talk about the activity chain, which is another way of cataloging activities. But as we will talk about breaking down the value chain, it's important to understand this concept of value chain, because I'll see little images of it. You know, so I may, this next slide may not be necessary in your, may not be necessary in this particular lesson for you to present, because I may present it in lesson 13. In fact, I intend to in lesson 13, because I'm talking about how you then locate elements of your value chain across globally, right? This idea of breakdown activities across the sort of this locate different value chain activities. So this is the idea of what the value chain is in terms of the activities of a firm, and so. Then understand the reading also talks about the idea of some things that will cause you to want to disintegrate your value chain, so separate things, put them in locations of their comparative advantage. Others there's other things that drive you in the opposite direction, to want to keep everything closely located, right? To co-locate all these activities, right? So again, this idea of this, and I raised this notion when I lectured in Baruch for IA-14 on corporate strategy. This idea of integration versus disintegration of the value chain and supply chain. This is just an example again from the reading about how you see that you can, besides having comparative advantages in products, you can have comparative advantage in not just in products but in actual stages in the value chain, right? So this shows the idea of here's an example of knitted apparel. At certain elements of the stages of the value chain, for example, the United States has a big advantage in raw cotton, right? This is relative exports relative to imports. So but then in actual producing the knitted apparel, a big disadvantage, right? So the idea is even with a given product, you might have a comparative advantage in certain stages of the value chain, which is why things break down and you locate certain things in certain locations. Then there's this data, we've all seen versions of this, of iPhone, where the iPhone comes from. So we have an iPhone, but it comes from all these different countries, everything from USA, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Italy, Japan, and China, of course, right? So again, understanding that in a product, you tend to break down elements of it. This is sort of inputs, or different stages, at least, if you will. Assembly is not an input, but different parts of the value chain. Here's another diagram they do not have in their reading, because they have the older version of Grant, but we have in our 9th edition. So I thought it was helpful for them to look at, an aircraft, the 787 Dreamliner. I've talked about Boeing before, and you will see. Of course, some of these aren't so terribly surprising locations. What's done in the United States, what's done internationally. Japan, not so surprising. It's interesting. The rudder is made in Chengdu, China, right? And this idea that of course Chengdu comes up because Chengdu is where Intel has one of their plants, right? It's an industrial park. So again, this idea of the value chain, disintegration of the value chain for any product, and that it gets globally dispersed. For our case study, we're talking about the semiconductors, and so the students should understand the stages in the semiconductor value chain. So again, this idea of they've talked about a little bit about this with the Intel case study, but design and verification, right? Then fabrication, that's the foundries, right? That's actual making of the chips. Most of it which happens in Taiwan these days. Then assembly and test, and that's what we're talking about in this case study. And then there's this idea of SCM comes up. So it's important to understand that's systems contract manufacturing. It's important to understand where that fits in. That's where they're building motherboards, basically where the chips are going to go on these motherboards, so they integrate in other systems before they then go to the final customer, right? So because there's several of locations that are described, because for example, Intel and AMD have certain locations in Asia that aren't assembly and test, but they are instead, SCM. So students might wonder where that fits. But we're focusing on assembly and test. The case study is called locating an assembly and test facility or test plant. So that's what we're talking about, is where do we locate that, right? And so then I transition to the case study, say, look, we're talking about Intel locating an assembly and test plant. It's important to understand where they are currently located. So first, the case study says that Intel has locations currently has locations in the following sites. Some of these are like Chengdu and Shanghai in China are assembly and test. I believe the one in Taiwan, if you look at Exhibit 2, Exhibit 2 tells you in detail, but I think some of them are SCM facilities. For example, I know the one in Thailand is an SCM facility, but again, that's where Intel is located right now. So again, we see 2 in China, 1 in Taiwan, 1 in the Philippines, 1 in Thailand, and 1 in Malaysia, right? And then what's important to know is also where the competitor is. The primary competitor in logic chips, right, is AMD. So here's AMD's location. So we see that AMD also has a location outside Shanghai. They have a location in Japan. They also have a location at a AT and a fab. That's important. They have an AT facility and a fab in Bangkok, right, area. They also had, they're also in Malaysia, they're also in Singapore, right? So again, you sort of see some overlap in some areas, although I think, and I could be wrong, I don't think they have the same type of, there's no co-location of AT plants, right? I think the AMD plant here is not maybe assembly and test. Anyway, but by the way, this is also helpful because if you look at I'll just give a short aside. If you look at the case study, you should be aware of this, right? Where is it? Here's the case study. If you actually go to the map, this is Exhibit 2, right? Let me see if I can rotate this easily. Okay, so there maybe that's a little better. Is you can sort of see that it's interesting. Japan doesn't even appear on the tape. Japan apparently didn't make the map, right? They're putting this micron here in Japan, but no, that's actually, sorry, that's not Japan. That's South Korea. But anyway, all right, little aside. Going back there, it's helpful to sort of understand that these are both SCMs. Some of these are not assembly and test plants. Some of them are fabs or SCM. Intel has no fabs in this area, right? Intel does not have fabs actually in Asia. They have them in the United States, Ireland, and Israel, I believe, right now, or at least the time of the case. So but then the issue is, the decision point is this, right? Intel's got to decide which of these following 4 locations it should be locating its next assembly and test plant. Should it locate up here, and this is where a third plant in China. This is Dalian, China, so it's just on the north of that bay there. I'm not sure what the name of that bay is, but closer to Beijing. Should it put it in Chennai, India? You'll notice it's sort of distant from its other facilities, right? It doesn't have any facilities nobody has any facilities in India at this point. Should it locate in Bangkok? Intel has a SCM facility there, but AMD actually already has an AT facility as well as a fab there in Thailand. Or should it locate in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam? So that's the choice. That's the decision they got to make. And so I then say, in making this choice, you're reading on the reading from your textbook, from the grant textbook, talks about this sort of decision tree, right? It's not really a decision tree. It's a selection of questions to ask, right? And you can go through each one of them if you want, right? But then I talk about, the framework we're using for today to motivate our discussion is from the where to locate, reading, and it has these 4 dimensions. We've asked some of these 4 dimensions, and it subsumes. They're complementary. They're not in conflict. The framework in the grant and the framework that I'm proposing here, or that Juan Alcacer is proposing, are not in conflict, right? But I think this is a little more strategic framework, right? A little more holistic framework, I think, in sort of looking at it. And it certainly is the easiest way to teach the case study as well. So he talks about, again, location characteristics, which are not just your natural endowments, but your institutional environment, the presence of clusters. It's important to look both not just the country level, but also at the individual site level. That's the basic location characteristics that are sort of obvious when it comes to location choice. And then government incentives, right? So what's the government willing to give you? They're giving you a good deal to come there, but not only what the incentives are, but understand why, understand what your bargaining power is, how willing is the government to support investment, these sorts of things. Now, you'll notice that I do this slide on purpose where I have location choice in the middle, because one of the big points that Alcacer is trying to make is that you've got to not just be about choosing locations. It's about having a location strategy, right? And so what really makes it strategic is his incorporation of these 2 other dimensions, which are the firm fit, right? So it is how well does that location fit with our strategy or with the firm, right? In terms of distance, and we mean distance not by just geographic distance, right? We're going to use the CAGE framework. I'll introduce the CAGE framework in lesson 13. It's in their reading. And so this idea of how you measure, really measure cultural, geographic, other sort of distances between economies or between countries, right? What are the fit with the firm capabilities? So basically what we're in fit with the business model. So what we do well, does that align with that location? Is it have, what we need based on our strategy? And then complementarity with existing locations, right? So the idea is that given where we've already located, right, is it in conflict or is it support, or is based on, we don't necessarily want to be, we might want to be close to somewhere where we already are, but how close do we want to be? Do we want to go into a new location and sort of open up a new market? So again, that's the idea of firm fit. And the last one is competitive effect, right? And the idea that, okay, what's competition like in that new market, right? Are we going to have, if we have a competitor that's also there, right? Is that going to create competition for inputs? But it also could create availability of inputs, right? Establish sort of specialty supply, skilled labor, things like that, or also product competition. Right? Are we going to end up competing in that market as opposed to being the dominant player in that market? So this is the framework. So I wouldn't say too much about it up front. I would introduce it up front. The students will have already read about it. So the whole idea is at the end, you'll see my conclusion slides. There's much more opportunity to go into more detail. What I wanted to do is the students have read about this framework, introduce it here, get into the case study discussion, and then in hindsight say, okay, then because by talking about it in hindsight, you can apply it to the specific lesson from the case study. Right? All right, so that's when I would transition, of course, to the discussion of the case. So the teaching note, I don't have a teaching plan. I actually might create one because the teaching note is so good, right? It's relatively good. I'll tell you what it does that I've supplemented. In particular, the basic idea is, as I sort of said, you will have students, right? So the teaching just going through the teaching note here, right? So you have the basic objectives, intended contribution, materials, things like that, right? Then the teaching plan he breaks down, and you'll see that he breaks down an introduction, then location characteristics, firm fit, competitive effect, government incentives, and wrap up. So he goes through each of the 4 dimensions of the framework. Now, the thing about the discussion, right, is that you're looking at 4 locations and 4 dimensions. So what that means is you could say, let's go location, 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 and analyze China thoroughly, then India, then Thailand, right? Or you could analyze, go by dimension, dimension, dimension. And it's interesting, you'll see the teaching note goes dimension by dimension. So first location characteristics, then I think he does firm fit, then he does competitive effect. So the teaching note talks about going dimension by dimension, but you'll actually see he gets it by asking about location, right? In other words, what he proposes doing is says, hey, you, based on your pre-class survey, remember we had the pre-class survey, you said China was the best location, right? Why did you say it was best location? And let them talk. And then as they give you reasons for why you think China is the best location, go ahead and fill out your boards. Now that's where I get to my board plans. This is probably the most important contribution that I have, besides the slides, is this board plan. So you'll see that's under the folder. You should see the board plan in the folder with the case study on our R drive, right? And so what you'll see is what I proposed is for each of the countries, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to preset my boards. I like to do that. I get there a little bit early, and I will write. You'll see I've actually got. I'm proposing using. How do we? Okay, so I'm proposing. How do I look at it in a scrolling sense? Let me see if I can do that. Oh, okay. I don't think it does that the way. So what I've done is I've actually you'll see that I have a board for China, for Dalian China, a board for Bangkok, Thailand, then a board for India, and a board for Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and then I have an extra board I'll talk about in a second. But what I would do, so I would go in and preset my board. I would write China, or Dalian China, because the individual location matters, not just the country, right? I'd put China up there and then put location characteristics, firm fit, competitive effect, government incentives, right, across the top of the board. And then I ask a student, I say, you chose China, why did you choose China? And as they talk about China, I put in under each of the headings, their answers. And you'll sort of see that I have mapped out here what I think are, some of the highlights. You can, whatever students say, you can put up there. But just so you organize in your head what's there. You can look at the different characteristics. So there's for China, you'll see for Bangkok, Thailand, then for India, and then for Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. By the way, the end choice ends up being Vietnam. Now, here's the teaching note. Go back to teaching note for a second. He actually does exactly that. You'll see, as he says here, he says, normally start by cold calling a student that supports Dalian China as the best site for Intel's new AT plant, asking why. Right? He actually suggests that he indicates that he thinks, in his experience, that students are more likely. China tends to be the most well, students tend to support the Chinese and Indian options, right? Because they're more familiar with those countries. I don't know if our students might be anti-China, so might not get, sort of China right away. But Again, remember we're making a choice from Intel's perspective, not from a national security perspective, right? And the reason he suggests that you look at China first is, one, because it might be the most popular answer among your students, or one of the more popular ones, and two, because it gives you a good opportunity to talk about location characteristics and then firm fit. And so you'll see that what I've got here, so the location characteristics, here you can sort of see there's a lot of reasons, a lot of positives for the location. In fact, I don't have any negatives listed here except for, potentially poor intellectual property protection. That applies to other countries too, right? There's actually Exhibit 5 in the case has a rating of their intellectual property protection. I believe China and India are rated poor, Thailand and Vietnam are rated moderate, right? But other than that, right, the location, low-cost labor, industrial growth, good infrastructure, end market proximity, the city itself is a large seaport, and Dalian is a large seaport, logistics hub, industrialized area. A lot of location characteristics are in favor of China. So in addition to students answering the question, many students probably saying they would choose China, they'll probably say location characteristics. You might have a number of students who think location characteristics are one of the most significant considerations for the China location, because they all have this. So it allows you to then map those things out. It's also, as the teaching note says, probably the one that has the most implication for firm fit, because the only country where Intel already has another assembly and test plant is China, and they have 2 there, right? And so the issue of firm fit is very interesting, because you can sort of say, hey, maybe it's because there are already 2 Intel, actually I should write this, Intel AT facilities, right, in China, right? And they also have, research and innovation labs in China. But the issue is that good or bad, right? So is it good because you already are there, so you've got maybe some established, who knows, technology, maybe you can move workers back and forth or inputs or something. That might be a good reason to be there because you already are there. Or, right, it could be a bad thing, because think about the idea if there's a trade war with China or something goes on, or China, they will have 3 of your Asian production all in one country, right? Is that a concern? Because then the idea is you are beholden to that, much more beholden to that one country. If there's any issues of reliability of supply, that may be a problem. So again, you get a good firm fit discussion, for China. So China is a very good country to start off with, according to the teaching note, and I certainly agree, because it helps you fill out location characteristics and firm fit. The competitive effect, the only thing I would say there is that it does say that competitors are locating in China, right? So even though U.S. companies are restricted from going to China in certain ways, the competitors are taking advantage of China. So maybe if you don't do it, others will. So there's a sense in which you should do it. As far as government incentives, there's a number of information there about their offering of tax breaks, et cetera. But they do put some restrictions. You can only sell in certain regions. There's certain maximum sales caps. You require joint ventures with other Chinese firms. That's one way they capture intellectual property. You also will see from Exhibit 5 that they have the highest commercial tax rates, right? And finally, this idea is important. This is probably the most important thing about government incentives, instead of a list of what they're offering, is how motivated are they? How motivated is China to give Intel a deal? Well, they've already got 2 Intel facilities, right? So they might not be as interested in giving them a deal to come into China as India or Vietnam, which has no Intel facilities in it, right? So again, that's this idea. So you could talk about it. So you could just talk about China. If you have the boards preset, and if you're using your smart boards, you can bounce around, right? You'll see that according to the teaching plan. Now, so the teaching note, right? You'll see that there are good. One thing I was going to do, and I probably might do for my own notes if I have time, is just there are some good follow-up questions, right? You might want to talk, just if they talk about this, some questions you can ask to say, as students talk about China as a country, you say, whoa, China's a big country, right? What about the specific city of Dalian? What do we know about that, right? Just because China has good infrastructure does Dalian, and you can get into students to sort of look and say, oh yeah, well, Dalian's a seaport, So again, the motivation to get students to think it's not just about choosing a country, it's about choosing a location, and China is not uniformly the same. So what I was going to say was the most valuable thing that you get out of the teaching note, above and beyond my board plan, is specific questions to ask to sort of get into some deeper sort of issues there, right? So anyway, so he maps out You know, these ideas, you know, talks about things like, for example, you want to add, as you get this list, as you list these traits. So how important is that, right? Okay, how important is that? How important is that? What really matters, right? Which are really the most important characteristics? Sort of this idea of, again, not to get students to the right answer, because in the end, it's not clear that the right answer is something that it easily solves mystery here, right? They ended up going to Vietnam, but I'm not even sure that we would be able to figure out from just from the case facts that was the right choice, right? The point is to get students understanding the process. That's why you ask questions like, you know, what's the point of this location? What good is it about, right? You know, here's some interesting questions about, you know, which location characteristics actually matter. You know, if being close to the customer is so important, why does Intel have an assembly and test plant in Costa Rica, right? You know, that doesn't seem, you know, seem to make sense. But again, this idea of trading off proximity versus labor costs. But there's also, by the way, you know, at the time, there actually are doing, you know, some manufacturing, at least in Mexico. So it's not that, Costa Rica is not that far from their production. But it gets students to think about the right questions, right? There are opportunity for the mini wrap-up, but all the points that are in the mini wrap-up are actually in my slides, in my conclusion slides. So if you know it's the conclusion slides, you certainly, if you are going sort of characteristic by characteristic, you could certainly do that, right? But or you could leave this sort of mini wrap-up stuff for the end. So as I mentioned, firm fit is listed here. This also is one that, as I said, you talk about China. It's basically this idea of co-location, and so some ideas you think about. Is it a good idea to, you know, have, you know, reliability versus low cost? This idea of, you know, this general idea: is it better to have, you know, one big location, the benefits from economy of scale, or multiple locations where you have reliability and less risk, right? So again, the teaching point is not, I keep saying this, but it's not about having them understand this case study. It's about understanding location decisions, right? And the idea of when you choose to have multiple locations, you know, in multiple countries, you are spreading out your risk, but you're also sacrificing things like economies of scale. So that's sort of, then this is, so you can probably have a good discussion both on location characteristics and on firm fit by talking about China alone, right? Now, then he suggests, right, this idea of, going back to the next one to talk about, he suggests being Thailand. Now, Thailand, of course, you can then say, oh, so-and-so, you chose Thailand, and you talk about Thailand, right? And you can talk about, you can talk about location characteristics, the firm fit, there's some stuff there. The most important thing with location, by the way, I'll highlight this right here, on this, is this idea of susceptible to flooding. That ends up being a decision factor, is that there is a big natural disaster risk in Thailand, right? So that is the most important sort of the location characteristics for Thailand. But the most important thing also in Thailand is the competitive effect. AMD is already there in Bangkok with a fab and an assembly and test plant, right? And so here you get the discussions. What are the pros and cons of co-locating with your competition, right? There's a benefits, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the competitive advantage of nations later in the course and clusters. But this idea of, look, if you go to Bangkok, there are already going to be the engineers who know about semiconductors, about you know, the technology there. So you already have trained human capital there. You already have specialized suppliers, right? You already know that, hey, AMD succeeded, so there's not some great barrier to an American semiconductor company coming into Thailand. But the cons can be, well, first of all, basic idea of congestion. This idea being that, you know, that when now you got more than one firm in the same location competing for the same labor, same input, it could lower the availability of those inputs and or raise the cost of them. There's also this issue of, you know, you worry that you're going to train people and you're going to train managers, they're going to go over to AMD, right? Or they're going to learn about your intellectual property. And it's worthwhile, and Juan Alcacer also suggests doing a sideboard. And that's what you'll see here, is I have a sideboard discussion just on that, right? I wrote clusters, co-location, agglomeration, whatever you want to call it, right? What are the benefits and costs? It's worthwhile to say, what are the benefits and costs, right? So because you probably will not be able to list all the benefits and costs of co-locating versus not co-locating, right? But understand that co-location comes with benefits and costs, right? And so these are sort of here's a laundry list of them. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see them on the board plan. Here's a laundry list of costs. The most important thing to understand, though, is that co-locating between AMD and Intel, AMD benefits more from being near Intel than Intel benefits from being AMD, right? The idea is the follower firm, right, who is maybe a little bit behind in technology, the idea is that they are able to they want to be able to steal or benefit, capture talent, right? So they sort of are able to free ride off the efforts of the bigger firm, or the leader firm, and or benefit from their talent training, et cetera. So part of the idea is a cluster or co-location is good, but it's better, right? Competitively, it's better for the smaller firm than the bigger firm. So all right. So where are we? So that's why if we talk about Thailand, right, you can sort of have that discussion and even go to that sideboard if you want with a competitive effect, right? All right. So finishing up Thailand, you might also talk about the government incentives. One of the big things here is that it does come up, I believe, in the decision in the end, is the case study sets a relatively unstable government, right? If you look at the Exhibit 5, again, it has a high corruption index, right, rated. And they've already said they're not going to negotiate cash grants. So this idea is they're not, and they do not have a lot of incentive. They already have a semiconductor fab and AT plant in Bangkok. So what is their incentive to pay for that? What's the marginal benefit to Bangkok of one more semiconductor AT plant? The answer is not so much, right? So the government is going to be less motivated to offer those incentives than in fact, I should even put this in here, right? The idea is, and I probably will, is the idea that, the government is less motivated to attract, a second, AT plant, right? And so that means they're less likely to offer additional incentives, strong incentives for Intel to locate there. All right, so that maps out to Bangkok and Thailand. Then they talk about going back to the teaching plan, right? So he talks about this idea of the competitive effect. So he talked about firm effect. Talk about the location characteristics, the firm fit, the competitive effect, right? And again, there's some good questions there you can ask that helps you to get deeper into those issues about the competitive effect and the benefits of all this cluster versus not clustering, right? So again, the best part of the teaching note might be these underlined italic questions, because I'm actually going to copy and paste those and have my own little cheat sheet of questions in front of me when I go in, if I can, right? And the last, of course, of the 4 dimensions is government incentives, right? And so when you talk about government incentives, one thing you might want, the government incentives, going way back to the framework here, actually, let me go back. So remember the framework here. The idea of the government incentives, there are, you want to think of what the various incentives that are available are, but also the firm's bargaining power relative to the government's willingness to support investment. So if we talk about, as you'll see in the teaching note, when we talk about government incentives, well, the first thing is you can say, well, what would you ask for? What type of incentives do firms care about, right? What actually matters? And so you'll see that, again, in my board plan, I have at the very end, you can either do it in the same board as you do co-location or separately. What are the different government incentives, whether it's reduced taxes or reduced import and export tariffs, reduced regulation restrictions, cash subsidies, what might be, sort of you have taxes, tariffs, subsidies. All of these things will come up later in the course too, by the way. So, but again, this idea of understanding what does it mean to get incentives from the local government, right? And so you might want to have a laundry list of these, and then after you have a laundry list, I would then go back and say, okay, if that's the laundry list, who seems most willing, who's going to give Intel the best deal? What's China's incentives to give them a deal? What is Thailand's incentives, right? Then what about India's incentives, right? And then finally, what about Vietnam's? Now I've talked in detail about what the key facts are to get out about China and Thailand. Let me talk about the key facts to get out about India and Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, right? So in India, right, there are the location characteristics that, they have low labor costs, right? They speak English. These sorts of things are good. Their IP protection is better than Thailand. It's moderate, so better than Thailand or China. They are the lowest of the firms, I think, in terms of the FDI. By the way, if you see FDI anywhere, that's foreign direct investment. They have lower foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP. So in other words, the idea is other firms are not investing in India. Foreigners are not putting money into India. So if they're not, what do they know that we don't know, right? It's an indicator of the appeal of foreign investment in that market. Talk about lagging infrastructure. An important factor here, this is an important thing, is the unreliable power grid. It says they supposedly have good capacity, yet all the firms there have a backup power, right? And so they obviously it's pretty unreliable. They've got to backup power because apparently it goes out, right? And also the water. There's not a lot of water, especially not located. And these facilities, I don't know about assembly and test plants, right? But if you go down to the Micron fab that's in Manassas, right, it is like the biggest consumer of water, I think, in all of the state of Virginia, except for the nuclear power plant on Lake Anna, right? I think it just consumes an enormous amount of water, right? And I don't know about assembly and test, but I certainly know for fabrication. So they require a lot of water, right? And you can see from, first of all, the case study says that the water is probably insufficient and it comes from far away. And it also, if you look at exhibit 6 this time, exhibit 6 in the case study, it shows you that the water is very expensive, in India. It's much more expensive, like 3 times as expensive for India per gallon or per cubic meter is the way they measure it than other locations. Other things about India that I think are important, there is an established industrial park. You can talk about that. There are other firms there. There's not other electronics firms in that park, as far as I know, at least not major electronics firms, but they do have, Ford Motor Company there. So there are other, multinational MNC, multinational corporations that are there. So with government incentives, again, you think about it, there are not a lot of foreign direct investment. So there's certainly an appeal. It says India was eager. There's a quote from the case study. They created these special economic zones. So in theory, they want you there. But first, if you think about politics, it's a rather unstable regime. So it talks about this idea of a coalition government, right, with a lot of different political parties to sort of rule it. So that's a problem, especially because this is very important. It's because there are different politics at 3 levels of government that you've got to deal with in India. You've got to deal with the city or local, the statewide, I think it's for province sort of politics, and the federal government. So you have 3 different levels of government, each wanting different things. They're not the same political party, right? The different political party. It didn't say that, right? But it says that they're fragmented political system. So you have different politics at 3 levels of government. That's something that's unattractive to firms coming to invest, is the idea of having to deal with 3 different levels of government, potentially wanting different things. They might want the opposite things, right? So that's sort of how I would map out. I would fill out on India. Then you could fill out on Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, right? So this, of course, is the one they do choose. Things that come by, it is, on the location characteristics, right? There's the labor cost is below China, so it's cheaper labor cost, very cheap labor cost, motivated workforce. Low disaster risk, it said, which is an issue because in Thailand they had a lot of flooding, other things, not so much in Ho Chi Minh City. High foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP. That suggests that it is attracting foreign investment. So it's a good environment in which to do business. They have the cheapest power. From exhibit, I think it's exhibit 6 again. The cheapest power. Exhibit 5 says they have moderate IP protection, which doesn't sound great, but it's better than China or India. A very young workforce. It says I think it's like 50% of the population is under 25, and only 25% are male because of the impacts of the years and decades of war. Right, the older generation has been decimated, and the men have been decimated. So they really will need leadership development there if they go there. Right. There's interesting stories about, they have a creek going in the middle of the site where they want to build. There's a creek going through the middle of the site, and the person showing them says, "Oh, it's great feng shui, to have this creek." And Intel's thinking, "We're going to have to move that creek. We don't want that creek." Right? And they say, "Okay, well, we can go over here. Here's a village of people. We'll just move this whole village." Right? And it's like, okay, well, but so there are some reasons that location is not ideal. Government incentives. So here's important. So the important things here is you can talk about the data. This says they're actively courting foreign direct investment. They're ready to make it work. Right? Virtually no prior investment in this sector, in the semiconductors. So the idea is Intel would be a big coup for them to get. So there's not another AMD Intel, unlike China or Thailand, right? This would be a real big get for Vietnam. So they're motivated to sort of give them a deal. and this ends up being very important, is the unified decision making, right? This is not like India, where you have 3 levels of government, many different political parties. It is one political party, the Communist Party, right? And in fact, the guy who was the plant or the location manager the location manager is actually or the technology part manager is a member of the Communist Party and a member of government, and he has a lot of decision-making authority. So if you get a deal with, he alone will deal with one person, right? And that person can then go get permission for everything. But the point is, you don't have to deal with the multiple decision makers like you had to deal with in India, and that ends up being an important thing. The case study says there is some concern about corruption and cronyism, right? And we find out in hindsight there is corruption there. But it's interesting because if you look at the time they're making the decision, you look at Exhibit 5, right? There's an index for the level of perceived corruption in the different markets, and it actually has the best score, right? So among the 4 locations, Vietnam, China, India, Thailand, Vietnam actually scores the best when it comes to, sort of the, corruption. There's the lowest level of corruption and cronyism, but, the case suggests that the case text and in hindsight suggests that it might actually be an issue. So anyway, but you should be able to, from that, you sort of see my board plan. The goal is, again, with all these board plans, remember, it's not to fill all these out, but it's sort of you understand what might come up, right? And you can certainly see from hindsight the key driving decision factors, right? So the idea is you know what's really important to get out, and other things maybe not so much, but let students go. And again, what I plan to do is I will have the boards preset, and I'll say, you chose China, why? And I'll fill this out as they say things, right? Then you chose, then move to Thailand, which will allow me to talk about the competitive effect in Thailand, right? And then I will talk about, sort of the characteristics of India and Ho Chi Minh. So I will bounce back and forth between them and fill them out, right? Sort of comparing them, right? I then will probably take it aside and talk about different government incentives, and then say who's most motivated and why, right? And then take a vote. So you end your discussion with saying, you vote, what do you think, right? And it might map what students said in their pre-class survey, or it might not, right? They might lean towards another one or not, and we'll see. And then you go to the slides, right, back to the slides, and you give an update, right? So here's the update. So I say, look, in terms of India, right, they had repeated, part of the problem with India was they had repeated negotiations with the government. So they're having to, again, the 3 levels of government, everybody wants their same thing. So the quote from the case, from the B case, which you don't have to hand out the B case. The B case is summarized in these slides here, right? The B case says the politics were unclear, right? They also had the unreliable utilities, electricity and water I talked about before. For Thailand, one of the big things is the natural disaster risk, the flooding, et cetera. They can't have that at their plant, right? So that risk was too high. They also had concerns about the government stability in Thailand. And also because the other firms are already there, right? AMD in particular, the government was not motivated to offer strong incentives. And finally, China, they had concerns about locating too much Asia production in one country. Do you want to have 3 assembly and test plants all in China, right? Because if something goes bad with China, it goes bad with all 3 plants, right? And also, China was not really motivated to offer strong incentives because Intel already had 2 assembly and test plants in China, right? Even if they were going to steal their intellectual property, they already had 2 other plants they could steal it from. So bottom line was China wasn't highly motivated. So, in February 2006, they chose Vietnam, right? I'm not going to read these slides to you, but the important things to understand is they did offer some good government incentives, grants and low rates for power and water. I thought this was interesting. They have a joint bank account. It's sort of like having a joint bank account with your parents, where they just keep putting money in it. Where between Intel and the Vietnam government, so I think Intel would make payments on things, the Vietnam government would put more money in the account, right, for site improvement, workforce training, ongoing maintenance. And all they really wanted was publicity. So it says, quote, they asked for big ceremonies that are announcements or building kickoffs, as well as publicity and pictures, right? So they wanted basically the Intel to promote their presence in Vietnam to attract others. They also, as I mentioned, the fact that the technology park manager, who was a government official, a member of the Communist Party, as it says, quote, this guy had the authority to make any and all decisions. He could go directly to the party and get permission. Again, that was a big decision factor too. It just made the process easy for them to choose to go to Vietnam. They had problems initially, right? It wasn't a very well-developed business manufacturing environment. I encourage you to do read the B case so you can see this information, right? There were limited local talent. They had to do some training programs, et cetera. There was, some blatant corruption, right? And some other hurdles like, you know, live ammunition from the war, you know, still on the construction site. So again, there's some stuff there. So there were some hurdles, but it ends up being a good success. Within 6 months of Intel signing on, the occupancy at the high-tech park went from 10% to 80%, right? Within 5 years, they had, you know, billions of dollars of capital investment in that park. And we end up by 2011, we have, you know, Intel is exporting $500 million worth of goods, worth of, you know, chips out of that park. Others in the park are exporting $256 million. And in fact, the industry grows so much locally. By 2012, a second adjacent technology park was full as well. And from Intel's perspective, quote, it was the let me fix that right there. Shouldn't be too, sorry. So from Intel's perspective, it was the most cost-effective, best location we've ever made, right? So again, they're very pleased with that location choice, right? So, you know, and your students may, you know, look, you take a vote, they may have identified Vietnam, you know, or not. It's not clear. It's not an obvious choice. It's not like there's some secret mystery you uncover and you go, the answer is Vietnam, right? But the point is not to get the right answer, but the point is simply to go through the process. And I think, so then you sort of, I wrap by highlighting the process. So I actually I have slides here to go through each one of these characteristics again, right? But with some specifics. So you'll see here, I have under location characteristics, so I go through and I have a slide with more details about more deeper consideration when it comes to location characteristics. Then in terms of government incentives and some more detailed consideration for government incentives, right? Then firm fit, some more detailed consideration for firm fit, and then the competitive effect, some more detailed consideration of the competitive effect, right? And then finally I sort of say, and then whatever. So here's your framework, wrap it up. And next time we're going to be doing the case study on China's Furious 5. It'll be the very next day. We're doing comparative business strategy. By the way, you might want to make sure you encourage students to read the case study in advance. If they're reading it Monday night for Tuesday class, it might be a problem. So, but that's on me. I got to make sure I get up there. Like I said, I got input from Nicole, and I got to get up there sort of what I want students to think about in terms of discussion questions for that case. But we'll get those up there soon. So, all right. Well, that's it for this first ever virtual FacPac. I will upload this video. Hopefully you can watch it, but we're going to have Q&A sessions Thursday afternoon, I think, depending upon how scheduling has changed, right? But this should give you, I think this is not too hard of a case study to teach. I think it's pretty, with what I've produced here, as well as the teaching note and just the nature of the case, I think it's a pretty easy case study to teach. Hopefully this helps, but I will be available. We will try to schedule that time tomorrow afternoon, Thursday afternoon, for a Q&A. Thank you.